story is really doing. And then what about the stories of Jesus's life? Is Jesus just showing up to give us some good advice, like to say, hey, I'm going to go die in a little while and that'll fix everything. And then, and then I'll rise again. But while I'm here, I might as well give you a couple bits of good news, good bits of advice. Make sure the end of Meaning of Life, Monty Python's The Meaning of Life comes to mind, where he's like, drink a bit of wine, read a book now and then, go to the massage parlor. It'll help you out. Work that out of your neck. Get some good exercise. Go for a walk every now and then. Try to keep it chill. And that's what really Jesus was doing. That's what the stories were about. But really the important part was the dying. That was, Jesus could have come and died as a baby and everything would have been fine, but he had to go ahead and finish out the rest of the story. And so, all of these things that happened, they just look like they're really not important to the story. And I think that's a really real mistake. And if we look at the story the gospel writers are trying to tell, what we see very clearly is that the story from Abraham to Jesus is all a part of one story. This is a bigger story, that Jesus is the working out of the story of Israel. It's not plan B. It is not a reset button. It is in some ways the way this story was supposed to go all along. And so let's dive into that and talk a little bit about it. And I think you'll see what I have in mind. I am going to share with you the scripture passages that I sent you in an email. So if you have those, you can just bring them up too. But they will also. Can you see that okay? Does that work? Okay. Of course, I don't have it on the text I want you to see, but would somebody unmute and read that Road to Emmaus story?
I will. Does that work, Reverend?
You're unmuted.
Me? I'm good?
Yeah. You're good. Good.
Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with him, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who had said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. And then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe that all the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures.
So this is part of what I have in mind. I mean, there's so much going on in this story, and we could unpack a ton of it. But at the very least, one of the really key things to notice is that the way Jesus understood his vocation, the way Luke's gospel is telling this story, is that Jesus says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, going all the way back, Jesus unpacks how that story is leading to, in particular, is leading to his crucifixion and resurrection. But it's also leading to all this other part, the whole story coming up to this point. Now, there's some things we have to say about that as we go along. If you go back and start reading, the Exodus story, you're like, I don't see any mention of Jesus in here at all. Or you go back and read the things that the gospel writer said. Oh, see, that text is pointing to Jesus. You go back and look at it and you go, it doesn't look like it's pointing to Jesus at all. You're probably right. And yet, the way the gospel writers want to tell this story is that what they're doing is that this story is a continuation and extension of that. So we'll unpack some of that because how that works, how the gospel writers are doing that, I think is important. So first I want to tell you this one part of this story. If you look in Luke's gospel, chapter 4, this has always been one of my favorite biblical texts. In Luke's gospel, Jesus is doing a whole bunch of stuff. He's bouncing around the Galilee, preaching. He's going to the synagogue on well, it wouldn't be Sunday, but he's going to the synagogue on Friday or Saturday, and he's teaching, which is something that he's been doing, and the word's getting out. People hear about him; they know something's going on. We've already heard in Luke's gospel, we've already heard the story of his birth. So if we're paying attention, we know something's interesting about this guy. Something's going on. There's something really weird happening here. But we may not entirely be sure what that looks like. But Jesus has been baptized by John in the Jordan River. Jesus has been tempted by Satan. And now Jesus is out doing his ministry. And in Luke 4, Luke writes, then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. So the part that gets left out is the sermon, the actual text of what Jesus says. In addition to this, of course, the funny story is, if you know that passage, the funny story is Jesus tells them some stuff, and they're really excited, and they think, wow, this is really amazing, and he's saying such fascinating things. And then he says some more stuff, and then they decide to throw him off a cliff. So, that's a different part of this story we could unpack another time. But Jesus is quoting from Isaiah chapter 61, which is that little inset box there. And it's interesting what Jesus puts in and what Jesus leaves out, and there's some interesting things going on there. But Jesus is quoting this passage from Isaiah. And this passage, remember, we've talked about the exile. Isaiah 61 is a text that is about the return from the exile. And it means going back to the promised land. It means going back. It means going home. It means recovery of the year of the Lord's favor, which is the Jubilee year, which is an ancient Jewish, ancient Israelite tradition. It goes back to the Exodus story, where all the Jubilee year is every seventh year. The land is fallowed, debts are forgiven, slaves are released, all these sorts of things. It's not something that necessarily Israel or the Hebrews ever really did, but it is something that was a part of their story. That this Jubilee year, this year of the Lord's favor, was something that was a kind of a guiding metaphor for the way they were to live. So you've got all this stuff here about. So somebody is claiming. The prophet in Isaiah is claiming, the Lord has anointed me, has chosen me, the Hebrew word there is Messiah, has chosen me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and release the prisoners. And Jesus says to them, he reads this passage, which is about the end of the exile, which is about God, the people returning to the land, but God returning to be with the people. This is a passage about what happens when God comes back, when the exile is over. And Jesus says, in response to this passage, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. In other words, to put this really bluntly, Jesus is saying, that's happening now, here. And they're all kind of like, really? Well, we've been waiting for this. This sounds great. This is exactly what we were hoping for. And of course, as I said, in a few verses, they try to throw him off the cliff. But the story keeps going. We get to Luke 7, so a few chapters later. I'm not going to read all of this, but I'm going to point out this first part. So in Luke's gospel, and this may be true in the other gospels, but it's clear, it's made very explicit in Luke's gospel. John the Baptist is Jesus's cousin. And John the Baptist is out preaching and calling people to repent because the kingdom of God is at hand. And he sees Jesus, he baptizes Jesus. And somewhere along the way, Luke is telling the people that something new is happening. Something's changing. The world is changing in this important way. And someone is coming into the world that's going to make the world better. That essentially, that God's kingdom is showing up, that God is coming back, and the end of the exile is at hand. And at some point, about this point of the gospel, John is arrested and he's in prison. He's in Herod's prison. The story, I don't remember how it's explained in Luke, but basically the story was that John thought that Herod shouldn't have married the woman that he was married to was his brother's wife, and he shouldn't, and that was against the law. And Herod wasn't really Jewish. He claimed Jewish ancestry. He claimed to be a descendant of the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, because he married this woman. It's all complicated geopolitical stuff going on. And John is criticizing Herod. And Herod was a bad guy. He was very violent and killed lots of people. And even if we in Luke's story, he's really bad, but in historical terms, he's also pretty bad too. So John's in prison, and in fact, John gets beheaded and is killed in Herod's prison. And so John is there in prison, wasting away, and he's thinking, well, I thought this was the return of. I thought everything was better. I thought the Messiah had come. I thought that things were going to change, and here I am rotting away in prison. So he asked some of his disciples to go and talk to Jesus and say, are you the one? Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another? And when the men had come to Jesus, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to ask, are you the one? Are we supposed to wait? And Jesus, and this is kind of the key little line here that Luke gives us, Jesus, who had just then cured many people of diseases, plagues, and evil spirits, and had given sight to many who were blind, answered them, go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. The poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me. And so then Jesus starts then telling the crowds that are gathered there about John. But this is the key thing of this key part of this story. This is the key part of this story. They come to Jesus and they say, hey, are you the one? Are you the one that's supposed to be making this happen? And Jesus says, you remember that passage in Isaiah 61? Remember what it'll look like when God returns? Remember what it's going to look like when the exile is over? Remember that whole thing about good news to the poor and sight to the blind and the oppressed in the year of the Lord's favor? Look, it's happening. All of that stuff is actually happening right now. It's happening around you. You can see it happening, and it's happening because of what I'm doing. The claim is very clearly from Jesus in Luke 4 and Luke 7, is that Jesus is saying all that stuff that you were waiting for, it's happening now. Now, John's going to get part of the story that part of what John is hearing is, hey, this isn't quite working out the way I expected it to. And that might be true. And that's another piece of the story that we'll unpack a little bit. But the idea is that Jesus is saying, look, this story that was thing that we've been waiting for all along, it's happening, and here's how it's happening. Now, let me go back to say this. This is important. If you go back and you read Isaiah 61, it is not about Jesus. And I say that because it's about a bigger picture. When Isaiah was writing, or whoever was writing that passage, Isaiah, there's like 3 different chunks of the book of Isaiah at least. whoever was writing this part of Isaiah had in mind something that was happening in the 6th century BC. They weren't thinking about 600 years later. They were thinking, or 550 years later, they were thinking about their own day and time. And that's really important. But the gospel writers are taking this bigger picture view of what it looks like when God's people are freed, when God's people, when God shows up and resumes and redeems and resumes that relationship or reconciles with God's people in this particular way. And Jesus is saying that's what I'm doing, and I'm doing it in a new way, and I'm doing it here in this time and place. So while the gospel writers are using these texts in a really important sense out of their original context, they're adding a new spin to them, giving them a new meaning. In fact, I mean, this is kind of an important thing. And I think I mentioned this last time, but if I didn't, it always bears repeating. If you get a Jewish Bible, what we would call the Old Testament, but what Jews would call the Tanakh, which is just an acronym, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. The Torah, the law, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim is the writings. If you go and get a copy of the Tanakh, it is organized differently than the Christian Old Testament. And that's important. Rabbi Mike likes to tease me because I said one time I was going to, what did I say? I can't remember. I was going to use something. I was going to use a psalm for something, and he said, "Well, that's fine. You can use it. Just don't put it don't put it in a new book and call it old." Because for Christians, the Old Testament is organized differently, and that changes the meaning in some ways. It changes the story. So for Jews, the Tanakh ends with the book of 2nd Chronicles. And at the end of 2nd Chronicles, the end of the story is that Cyrus, the Persian king, who 2nd Chronicles refers to as the Messiah, he's the chosen one, the anointed one. Cyrus is sending the people home, so the end of the exile. And that's really this important part of the way Jews understand that story. It is a cyclical story of God, of exile and return. And the story ends with the return. Christians, however, have organized the Old Testament to end with the book of Malachi. And that's important because at the very end of Malachi, there is this announcement that the world is going to be very different, that someone is coming who is going to be this person that's been expected, that's going to make all this difference. And in Malachi, it specifically says that someone is going to come to lead the way, to prepare the way. A messenger will come and who will prepare the way for the chosen one. And in this passage in Luke 7, Jesus starts talking about John in this way. He says to the crowd, he says, "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at?" Talking about John. A reed shaken by the wind. A reed was the symbol for it was the political symbol for Herod. So when he says a reed shaken by the wind, are you looking for a new kind of Herod? Is that what you went to look for? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Oh, those people live in fine, people who put on fine clothing and live in luxury in royal palaces. Are you looking for another political leader when you went to see John? What did you go out to see? Did you go out to see a prophet? Yes, that's what John was, but he was more than a prophet. He was the one that the old prophets, in this case Malachi, was talking about. "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you." And so he says, this is what's going on. John was Elijah. That's the way Malachi describes it, that there will be a new Elijah coming. This is why this is part of this idea of a new Elijah coming is an important piece of kind of the Jewish story. But a new Elijah is coming, and the new Elijah will be the herald of the Messiah. Well, if John's the new Elijah, well, who is Jesus then? Jesus doesn't say it clearly, but he's being very, very clear about what's happening here. So again, this old story giving way to giving way to a new story. And in some ways, this is the way Luke wants us to understand the story, understand what's going on. Jesus is this the fulfillment of these things going on in the old story. Even if in some ways those things are being taken out of their context, they're being refashioned to understand a new understanding of what God, a new way of understanding what God is up to. And so I asked you to think about some of the miracle stories. Do any of you have any that you wanted to think about, or that you had thought about in the meantime? Here's an interesting story. You should be able to just hit your space bar or unmute yourself if you want.
Yeah, I did some thinking. So for those of you who, I think Bradley knows this, but for those of you who don't know, I went to a Catholic school when I was a kid, and my two favorite miracle stories were the turning of the multiplying the loaves of bread and transforming the water into wine. I always really enjoyed that story, and I also like the story of when Lazarus was raised.
Raising Lazarus, yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking about them in terms of like what they meant for in connection with the concept of like what would be good news to the people of that time. And I think it's kind of easy to see that it's always this, at least with those two stories, it's this like to use the phrase you used earlier, Bradley, the freedom of the plentifulness and the multiplying of the loaves and turning into wine. That all you have to do is ask and it will be given. And then raising Lazarus from the dead, the freedom from the suffering of losing one's loved one. So that was kind of the context I was thinking of it in. Maybe it's a little simplistic, but
No, that's really lovely. I mean, when you said that about I hadn't thought about this in a while, but when you said that about I mean, there's so much going on in that the wedding of Cana story. I mean, God, that's such a great story. And John uses the miracle stories in a particular way. So that's its own, that we could do a 3-month class on just how John uses the miracle stories, but I wouldn't be qualified to teach that. But there is this passage in Isaiah 25. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines, and he will swallow up death forever. And this is a passage we use at funerals a lot. That there's this whole idea of like, well, again, what happens when God shows up? Oh, it's a party. I mean, it's a party. It's a feast. There's wine. It's one of the reasons, I'll be honest with you, I'm really missing communion these days. This is the longest I've gone without communion in 20 some years. But I was thinking about, I'm not missing wine. I don't drink wine, but I was thinking of like it's one of the reasons why I don't like using the little styrofoam wafers for communion, because it feels so stingy. It's like, oh, here's this just tiny little bit of Jesus that you get. Whereas what we really ought to have are just tables of, I mean, there should be so much, we should be dumping wine out into the streets. There should be so much left over every Sunday. The Altar Guild would be pretty grumpy about that. But I mean, the idea is just that this is like overwhelming graciousness and generosity and this great banquet. And that's what's happening in this story. And of course, that's going to be, I mean, think about, what Jesus says in John, the passage that Jesus reads in Luke 4, right? Good news to the poor, food for the hungry. I mean, this is the image that people have of what will it be like when God returns. It will be a feast, a banquet. The loaves and fishes does some of the same work, right? You've got, in fact, John has, Gretchen, correct me John has 2 versions, and the other Gospels tell a different, their own version of the story, right? So each gospel has a version of the feeding of the 5,000 or the 4,000, depending on which story you're reading. And I'll point out, by the way, this is one of those weird little things that the Bible does sometimes. It's the feeding of the 5,000 plus women and children. So it's not just 5,000; it's 15,000 or 20,000 or whatever. It's a lot more people. But it's that story. There's a lot going on in those stories. So in one version of the story, in Matthew and Mark, I think it is, there are 12 baskets of bread left over. Well, that number 12 is so symbolic about Israel and the disciples, 12 disciples for 12 tribes of Israel. And it's like the bread is being, the renewed Israel is being, or fed and refreshed Israel. In John's gospel, I think it is, there's 7 loaves and 2 fish left over. And that's really this, or there's 7 loaves and 2 fish, and then they extend that out, and it's the feeding of the 4,000. And that's important because 7 is this number for completion and wholeness. And the idea there is that given the place where that miracle takes place, it's probably Gentiles. And so it was feeding Israel, and now it's feeding the Gentiles. So not only is Israel being fed in this story, that blessing, God's blessing, is being expanded to all the people. And so you've got kind of both of these things going on. So so it's a great, those are really great stories because they got all this stuff going on. Yeah, absolutely. And then raising of Lazarus, you've got life over death. You've got, some in John's gospel, part of what's going on is there's this insistence that Jesus is God incarnate, that Jesus is Israel's God in the flesh. And all the Gospels are saying that in some ways, but John wants to be really insistent about it. And so in some ways, the miracles are signs. That's the way John describes them. They're signs of this happening, they're signs of Jesus's relationship to God, the Father. And so you've got a couple of things going on there. In the other Gospels, though, there's a common thing that's what all the Gospels are doing, that all the miracles are really just about showing us that Jesus is divine. And that might be right, but it's showing that Jesus is divine in a particular way. Not just that Jesus has superpowers, but that Jesus actually is, what Jesus is doing is what God is doing. I think that's the way I would describe it. Any other miracle stories? I got a couple that I wanted to highlight, but any of the other ones that you wanted to, or Molly, do you want to say anything more about those? No, thank you, Gretchen. Gretchen corrected me. It's Matthew has the feeding of the 5,000 and then the 4,000. Yeah. I think that's what my notes say, but I was going so fast I missed it. Molly, did you want to say something else? I'm sorry.
No, that was all I had to say about that.
Any other stories that you can think of? I was talking to Tom, go ahead.
I was going to say one that I liked was when I think they were all in this room that was completely full, nobody else could get in, and they dug through the roof, like the ceiling, the roof of this building, lower a guy down and to get healed. And I haven't read that in a while, but it wouldn't surprise me if the leaders at the time were all, you can't do that on this day or whatever. I don't know if it was the Sabbath, but that was a frequent theme where it's the law. And but really just that the people were so wanting to get this guy healed from his issue that they dug through the ceiling of a place and lowered him down into this super crowded area to make that happen.
Yeah, my kids brought that one up. I was talking about this with the kids the other day, and Miriam brought that one up. I'm forcing my children to do a version of this class. They said some really dumb things the other day, and I was like, okay, well, who's getting 2 hours of Christian education every week with their dad? It's going okay. It's not a good way to punish kids, I must say. But that one was a really cool one because, you know, like these people they have this experience and they want Jesus so bad. They want to encounter. They're so desperate for an encounter with the divine that they like tear through the roof. And it's, you know, I love the version of this in Franco Zeffirelli's movie. It's Peter's house. And they're like, Peter's like, what are you doing to my roof? Get the hell out. He like freaks out, you know, yells at him and stuff. Those Sabbath stories, Tom, are really interesting because the healings that happen on the Sabbath, they happen over and over again. And in some ways, you kind of wonder, well, why does Jesus keep pushing this line? Because he's already, I mean, at least in terms of the story, yeah, okay, we get it. You can heal on the Sabbath. Like it happens over and over again. And so I would think that something more is going on. And maybe part of the story is, you know, who's the Lord of the Sabbath? God is. You know, and so part of it is, I mean, the gospel writers sometimes were being anti-Jewish in some of that and saying you're so caught up with the law. And I would be careful about how we understand, you know, how much we take of Judaism, how much we learn about Judaism from the Gospels. We have to be careful. They were written much later, and there is some animosity there that's intentional. But certainly the idea of the all too human tendency to say, well, wait a minute, we have rules about this. You know, God's grace and God's love is fine, but we've got rules, and we're going to follow the rules. You know, whatever else is going on. I mean, priests have a real problem with this, right? I want to be gracious, want to show you that God loves you, but we've got rules about how we're going to handle that. So everybody calm down. No tearing through the roofs. That kind of property committee would get pretty grumpy about that. I was thinking, I mean, there are all these stories. I mean, think about all the stories of healing, of multiplying food, of you know, what does Jesus say? Go back to that you know, that Luke 4 passage. Anytime you see freedom, anytime you see recovery of sight to the blind, anytime you hear, you know, someone's ears being opened, that all goes back to these ancient things that the prophets talked about. This is what it's going to be like. People are going to dance with joy when God returns. People are going to hear the good news. People are going to see, you know, all these things. And so in some ways they are real things that happen, but they're also metaphors for this larger thing that God is doing in the world. And so we've got tons and tons of these. One of the stories that I love is in Mark 4. There's this passage where Jesus calms a storm. So Jesus is on a boat with the disciples, and evening shows up. Evening comes, and they get in the boat and they're going across the side of the lake, and this huge storm shows up, and it says a great gale rose and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" I love that they call him teacher there. It's just kind of interesting. He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" I mean, they're confused. They're confused not because they don't know what this means. They're confused because they know exactly what it means. If you go back to the Psalms, you can read Psalm 65. You silence the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, the tumult of the peoples, right? You calm the waves and the people. Psalm 89, you rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Psalm 107, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. I mean, they know these verses. They know these Psalms. When they see Jesus do this stuff, that's what confuses them because they know exactly who is in charge of that. They know exactly who can do those kinds of things. And they're watching Jesus do it, and it's not lost on them. You know, the same with raising Lazarus from the dead. Jesus says to Mary when he meets her on the road, do you believe in the resurrection of the dead? And he says, I am the life. He says, I am the life. And so he's saying, who has power over life and death? It's God. And Jesus is saying, I've got this. I can bring resurrection and life now because I am in charge of that. I think of stories like there's the raising of the synagogue leader's daughter, and then there's the healing of the woman with the hemorrhage. These two stories that go parallel with one another, depending on which gospel you read. The synagogue leader, this man shows up and says, my daughter is sick and dying. Come and heal her. And she's 12 years old. And then there's a woman an elderly woman that Jesus encounters who has a hemorrhage for 12 years, so the young girl is dead, and the woman has she's hemorrhaging, which makes her unclean. And so there's this issue of unclean means she's ostracized from the community. She might have, depending on how you understand the story, she may have blown I think the story says she blew all of her money on cures that never worked. The idea that she's had this hemorrhage for 12 years, it's kind of like, this is, to be graphic, this is Israel's bloody history that has never been repaired or redeemed or renewed. The little girl is, in a sense, Israel's future, who is kind of aborted from the beginning, right? She's never going to, the idea that 12 shows up is there's just like light bulbs ought to go off. Wait a minute, something weird's happening here. The other story that I was thinking of, there's a weird story in Mark where Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee to an area called Gennesaret, which is probably a Gentile area. So probably not an area where it's probably not Jews living there. And we know this because they're swine herds, and usually Jews don't keep keep pigs. They're unclean animals. And he goes there, and there's a man in the tombs. He's living in the tombs, right? He's living among the dead, as if he were dead, but he's possessed with a demon. Well, with demons, we find out. And he comes and he yells at Jesus. The demons are speaking, and they say, "We know who you are." And Jesus asks them their name, asks the demon's name, and they say Legion. Now, what's a legion? A legion is a Roman army. And so the idea that this is a spiritual issue. This man is possessed with a demon, an evil spirit named Legion. But in some ways, it parallels this really powerful thing that's going on, that the people are possessed by Rome. I mean, they are occupied, and so it is spiritual and it is political and it is social, all at the same time. And then Jesus sends the demons into the swine, and the swine run into the ocean and die. And this is a really powerful story. There's a lot of layers going on about what's happening there. So the point is, any other miracles you want to talk about? I mean, I might not be able to riff on all of them, but you might have some good ideas of what they're saying. Any other cool miracles that you think of? Yeah. Oh, Molly, go ahead.
I was just going to say it always, when I was in school, they never talked about the exorcisms very often, probably because they didn't want to give the kids nightmares. But when I became an adult and learned just how many different exorcisms there were, compared to, I mean, obviously there's all these different other types of healings, but there's a surprising number of exorcisms, though the most memorable one is the one that you just described.
Well, the very first thing that Jesus does, so in Luke's gospel, the first thing that Jesus does after he's baptized and tempted by Satan is he goes and preaches in the synagogue in Nazareth. That's the first thing that Luke tells us. In Mark's gospel, the first thing that Jesus does is he goes to the synagogue, he preaches this amazing sermon, everybody's super impressed, and then he casts out a demon. And I've always loved that story because I think that's exactly what every priest wants to do, give a really good sermon and then kick the most difficult parishioner out. I said that in a sermon one time, And this guy in the back of the room goes, "I'm not going anywhere." I was like, perfect. It was just perfect. But this idea of, what is Jesus contending with? He's not just contending with he's not just contending with people's hunger. Like, people are hungry, and that's important. And he's talking about that. But he's also talking about these larger social and political issues. I mean, the legion. He is dealing with the Romans. The Romans are a problem, but there is also this spiritual problem, this deep spiritual possession that the people, and I mean, if you think about, I don't think it makes sense to deconstruct those stories as make them about mental illness. That's a mistake. They weren't talking about mental illness. Now, could some of the people in the story have been schizophrenic and that's what Jesus was dealing with? Maybe. And presumably, if Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and can raise people from the dead, he can cure schizophrenia. Sure. But I think that's not what the gospel writers are talking about. The gospel writers are talking about this layer of spiritual captivity. I mean, the people are exiled from themselves, from their own spiritual self. They're exiled from their vocation. They're exiled from their own land. They're exiled from the work of their own hands. They don't have enough food, but they are also possessed by this spiritual demonic force that's at work in the world. And we could talk about what that means. And I don't want to deconstruct it because I think it's a real thing. I mean, I don't think it's a deconstruction to say that racism, poverty, sexism, violence, those things are demonic powers, and they have control over us in a way that we are often unaware. And that is a social and political and economic problem, but it is also a deeply, deeply spiritual problem. And those things interrelate. It's not like we can say, well, I'm going to go work on my spiritual life. You never hear in the Gospels, Jesus never says, I'm going to take some time out for my spiritual life, because those things are not separate. They are all connected. I mean, the shooting of this guy, Ahmaud Arbery, that happened in Georgia a few months ago, that has really taken off in the news in the last week, that is a spiritual problem. That is a spiritual crisis for this nation. It is, but it's connected to racism and violence and all those other things, and they're all connected. I was teaching Judah earlier what a tangent was. Well, that's a tangent. Sorry, but I don't think it's wrong. I think there's something to it. Yeah.
If I could interject,
please.
It's interesting that I'm glad that you brought up the topic of mental illness, because I've heard a couple times people say, "Oh, well, that's what those exorcism stories are about. Is they're just about mental illness." But as you were explaining it, I'm reminded of that. I don't remember who said it, but there's a quote that says, "Before you automatically go diagnosing someone with a mental illness, make sure first that," and pardon my language, "that there just aren't a bunch of people in that person's life who are just assholes."
Yeah, right. That's fair.
And I think that that's an interesting connection, that even at that time, the distinction between the spiritual issue resulting from people not being well connected and treating each other well versus it's just that one person's problem.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, and when we talk about it, I mean, it's people talk about this all the time, right? That racism, the effects of racism, cause depression, and I mean, just a whole list of issues. That's not to say that all people of color are damaged in some way, but it does talk about how the world creates these huge barriers for people that can have mental and physical and social effects that are way beyond, and that can be true for, physical sexual abuse. I mean, all these sorts of things. And the fact is, I was diagnosed with depression. Sometimes my depression feels like a spiritual issue. Like if I hunker down and do certain things, I can I can be better. And other times I need medicine. And other times I need therapy. And other times I just need being around people, and I need other things to make that fixed, to fix myself. It's not really fixed, but you know what I mean? To what's the word I want to cope. I need coping mechanisms, and there are a whole bunch. And some of them seem more spiritual and some of them more, but praying it away doesn't work. That's not what, but the gospel stories are different. In the gospel stories, God shows up, and God shows up to deal with this incredible layer of the problem that people weren't able to deal with. Like nobody could deal with this demoniac in the synagogue in Mark's gospel, or the demoniac in Gerasene that was in the tombs, or these stories. Nobody else could deal with this, so God has to show up and deal with this significant spiritual captivity that the people are dealing with. So, trying to find where I am in my notes because we've just bounced around. So the point is, so we've done all this stuff talking about these things that Jesus has been doing, these miracle stories, and I realize it's about 5 minutes still, so I'm going to wrap up here. That there's so much going on in these stories, and we go back to, again, we get to actually let me if we get to go back to that Emmaus story, and Jesus is saying, listen, how foolish you are to not realize that so much of what was going on was working out all these old story. Like this is Israel's history. I mean, go back to the beginning. What was Abraham? Why did God call Abraham? To bless the whole world. What is Jesus doing? Jesus is like, I'm working all that out. I'm working all that out. All that stuff that Isaiah said, we're trying to make that happen. We're making it happen right now, right here. This is what's going on. And it's not just for you. This is why they try to throw Jesus off the cliff. Jesus is not just for you. It's for everybody. We're doing this for everybody. Don't think just because, in fact, Jesus says to them, don't think just because you're, the people of Judah, that God is just doing this for you. This is for everybody. And, and all of these miracle stories in so many ways bear that out. This is what it looks like when God shows up. This is when the kingdom of God is at hand, when the kingdom of God comes near, it's going to look like this. That's kind of what Jesus is trying to is doing. And so then the gospel writers are spelling this out by saying, here are all of these ways that Jesus looks like God in the flesh. In fact, in the gospel that we read today, we hear some of this. So that second part, in that gospel we read it during church this morning, Philip says to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father and we will be satisfied. I don't know what Philip is looking for. I don't know. I think maybe fireworks or something crazy. Did you ever see that movie, The Stand? Like at the end of the movie, The Stand, I'm going to ruin it for you, but it's like 25 years old now. So if you haven't seen it by now, too late. And it's not any good anyway. This is that Stephen King novel. The bad guys get a nuclear weapon and they fire it off to kill the good guys. And a hand literally comes down out of the sky, grabs the nuclear weapon and turns it around, and it goes back and kills all the bad guys. That's sort of the end of the movie. Of this 7-week-long mini series. It's like, that's the end. But it's that's what Philip wants. I know Philip wants the hand of God to come down and start poking people or something. Jesus says to him, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. But if you do not, then believe me because of the works themselves. I sent some of you, those of you who are preparing for baptism, I sent you a couple of books. And one of them is this book, the Tokens of Trust. And Zach, yours are on the way. I just got an email from Amazon saying they're coming. I accidentally clicked early shipping for the other two. I did something weird. But in Tokens of Trust, Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, talks about this, and he says that the life of Jesus is so finely tuned to what God is doing, to what God is up to, that what Jesus is doing is what God is doing. And it's this really powerful, he gives a really good explanation, way of understanding what that looks like. But what Jesus is saying is, look, when you see what I'm doing, everything that Jesus does is kind of like an enacted parable. Like every action is like, what would it look like what would it look like if God was back? What would it look like if the exile was over? What would it look like if we were finally forgiven? What would it look like if God was totally in charge of the world? It would look like this. It would look like a wedding feast where late in the game we ran out of wine and somebody brought in the best wine we could imagine, and now we've got way too much. It would look like my brother has died and he's been in the tomb for 4 days, but he's coming back from the dead. It would look like people who were blind from birth are now able to see. It would look like people who were blind metaphorically could now see and understand the world in a new way. It would look like people tearing open the roof because they were so desperate for a divine encounter that they're tearing off the roof, to get to God. And in some ways, this is what's going on. That beautiful passage, and I'm going to wrap up here, but that beautiful passage in John 1, the prologue to John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. I may even have that here for you. Yeah, there it is. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The Greek word for word is logos. Jesus is the logos of God. But logos means all sorts of things. And I've always liked the idea that it refers to logic. That's where we get the words like biology, and you think about all these words, logic, logos. I've always liked the way to think about it as logic, like the way someone thinks. Like, what is your logic? And so if Jesus is the logic of God, Jesus is the way God thinks. This is how God thinks. Then we can make sense of this idea that Jesus is the climax of the story, this great rescue mission, as it were, that God had in mind all along. It makes sense of all the strange turns in the story. So you have the choice of Abram and Sarai before they become Abraham and Sarah. You've got all these stories of miraculous births to barren women, Sarah, Hannah, Elizabeth. You've got these constant reversals in the story. You've got the choice of the small shepherd boy David as king, who's not the one that everybody expected to be the king. You've got the calling and wooing of Israel in the first place. These stories where God does things that don't seem like the obvious choice. And this continues in a straight line through to the birth of Jesus. God who is with us, God who is incarnate. Of course, Jesus is born to an unwed teenage mother in a barn surrounded by stinking shepherds and animals, according to at least one version of the story. And it culminates in the cross, which we're going to talk about next time. But if this is the logic of God, if this is the way God thinks, then we can go back to Paul's idea that we ended with last time, right? The message about the cross, here it is, that passage on the screen share. The message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Again, this idea that there's something about the way God thinks that's very different from the way we would have expected. The things Philip wants a divine show of strength. He doesn't want God to wash his feet. He still wants the Romans to get kicked in the teeth. And that's not the way God thinks. And so we're going to move, the next week we're going to move. And so all of these stories, all of these miracle stories in the life of Jesus is to connect it to that longer story, that larger story. But the idea is that all of this story is in some ways the outworking of the way God thinks, the way of God's logic. And so next week we're going to talk about the cross and what that looks like. And this is where we get into some deep weeds, because the theology of the cross is complicated, it's complex. The Bible is sort of all over the place on it. The councils of the church, like the Roman Catholic Church, and for centuries never said this is what it means. There's all kinds of stuff in the liturgy that describes it in multiple different ways. But if you were to ask certain Christians, they'd say, no, it means this and this only. And what we're going to find out is it's way more complicated than that. And frankly, way more beautiful than that. So I think. But, it's 5 after. Thank you all for your time. I really don't like doing it on Zoom. Because you can't interrupt me as easily. And without that, I just will talk. And I don't mean to do that. But it is my way. So, everybody okay? That makes sense. Do you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, exclamations?
That made a lot of sense to me. I'd actually never heard any of those miracle stories, so this was really interesting.
Aha. Excellent. It's good stuff. Go and read. Your homework is to read all of the Bible. No, I'm just kidding. Before next week. No, actually, for a little bit of homework, I would ask that you read in the Gospels, read the crucifixion stories. I'll try to send them to you. I can send you like a sheet with them in parallel. I think I already have that produced. It'll be easy to send out. But if you read those, read them and look for differences, and think about, like, why did Luke tell the story this way and John tell the story this way? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are pretty consistent. John tells the story in some really different, interesting differences that I think give us some clues as to what's going on. So, did you want to say anything about that, Gretchen?
No, I was just saying, like, the synoptics, we call the first 3 synoptic gospels because they're very similar.
Because they cheated off of each other?
Because they, like, Matthew and Luke had Mark in their hands, most likely, or somebody who had Mark memorized in their midst. But John has a very different viewpoint, and he's trying to tell it from a very different way. And so it is really interesting to look at all 4 of the crucifixion stories and try to figure out, like, what community are they talking about, or what community are they talking to? What is it they really want that community to get? And now, what do we get from them? Because the atonement theologies are vast, and different denominations cling to different ones sometimes. But probably my favorite class in my PhD was taking a Christology class about the atonement of Jesus from my own perspective. We had to write our own atonement theology, and that was really helpful to me to understand, like, how do I understand Jesus' death and resurrection and why that had to happen? And how I understand it doesn't necessarily have to be how you understand it. And that was really, really kind of fun and eye-opening. And so
I would say only twice in my life, only twice in my ministry, have I ever been, and I'll use this word lightly, but have I ever been attacked after a sermon? And one of them was when I said the church has never officially defined what happens in what the cross actually does. And this lady, like crazy, she was so mad at me. She was like, "We know exactly." And I was like, "No, we don't." But it's something that people feel very strongly about, especially if they've been in church for a really long time. So I would encourage you to do that. I mean, that's part of your sort of kind of homework as well. Just think about both. If you come from, if you have certainly if you come from a Christian tradition, think about what it means from that perspective. Like, what do you remember being taught, and think about all the different. Think about what that might mean, what the cross might mean, given what you know, and just what have you picked up? I mean, like, what do you like in the images you've seen, the way you hear people talk about it, or the way we talk about it in the liturgy, or the way we talk about it in our prayers, or in Scripture. Scripture's kind of weird about it. It's real weird. Even Paul's really weird. So, hey, thanks so much. It was good to see you all. Be well, and we'll be in touch. I think I said this today, but there will be some plan coming out from the bishop about reopening, and we've got to do, St. John's will have to do our part of that, but it's going to be, I doubt we're going to have any chance to meet in person before the end of the month. So we're still going to be doing this at least through the end of the month. Okay. Tom, were you raising your hand or waving? Okay. Got it. I saw the little yellow hand go up. So, all right. Thanks everybody. See you later.
Thanks, Bradley.
Thank
God bless.
you.